Welcome to Big Ben Sammy TV. Thanks for tuning in. I know your time is very important. Thanks for tuning in. So the Old and New Testament, the Bible, is comprised of two books. The first book is the Old Testament. It has 39 books of itself. 39 books by different authors. Some authors are the same, some are different. Then the New Testament is the second part of the Bible, which is 27 books in the New Testament. So the Old Testament starts off with the creation story, God creating everything. There's a garden, there's a tree of life, there's a river of water of life, there's a paradise, and then God creates man in his own image and likeness. He makes Adam. Out of Adam's side, he makes Eve. So you have the first couple, Adam and Eve. They have two kids, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and Cain is banished from the garden, and he leaves, and his family begins to have to protect themselves and make cities and different weapons and music because they don't have God, so they have to entertain and protect themselves. Adam and Eve, they have another son named Seth, and Seth, now that's the line of life. Their kids begin to continue to follow God all the way up to Noah. So there's about 7 generations or so up to Noah. Noah, we know by that time the whole earth is not following God. They don't care about God. They're actually so offensive to God, he decides to wipe out the whole earth. But Noah finds grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is all still in Genesis, the first book in the Bible. Noah, he builds an ark. He saved his family. They have 3 kids. Eventually, we see time passes, and man wants to build a tower, and this is in Iraq area, Babylon. They want to build a tower to God, and God doesn't like it. It's offensive to God, so he makes it so they can't speak the same language, and then that's the Tower of Babel. Down the road some ways, this is still Genesis, we find Abraham. God calls this man out of Ur of Chaldee, which is modern-day Iraq. He calls him out of Ur of Chaldee. There was a place where people were worshiping idols. You'll see in the Bible, God hates when man worships something other than him because, that's offensive to God. He calls Abraham out. Abraham believes God. He's known as the father of faith because he believed God and it was counted righteousness. And God promised Abraham and his seed that they would be God's representative on earth pretty much. And he said to your seed, not to your seeds. So he was actually talking about Jesus, which comes in the New Testament, okay? The whole Old Testament is a picture of what's going to come in the New Testament. So, but we still see that God, he blessed Abraham and his people, the Jewish people. They became his representatives. We see that he has a son named Isaac. They have a son, Jacob, and then he has a son named Joseph. Joseph goes to Egypt. He becomes second in command to Pharaoh. So now we see the Jewish people in Egypt. Some time passes, they become slaves actually, and one of the Jewish people, Moses, he's raised in the Pharaoh's house. He leaves Egypt. God tells him go back to Egypt. He frees God's people. They go into the wilderness. Moses goes on a mountain. He gets the 10 Commandments and the blueprints to the tabernacle, which is the tent that God's going to dwell in as his people represent him on the earth. Now we get into some other books where the Jews cross over into the good land with Joshua. He leads them in. They take over, which today is Israel, modern-day Palestine, and they start taking over that land. Now they represent God in that land with the tabernacle, which is the moving tent that they bring with them, where God dwells. Then we go on to some more books, Judges, where they fall away from God, they come back to God, they fall away from God and worship idols, they come back to God. Then we get into Kings. There's David and Solomon, the most well-known kings. They actually make that tent into a building, into a real temple, into a big temple for God to dwell with them. Then we find out in later books, the Jews are captured, some come back, the temple and the city is kind of run down, they rebuild it, and that becomes the glorious ending of the Old Testament. The temple is rebuilt, and it's like really beautiful. We also have some minor prophets, major prophets, poets. A lot of them it's just talking about God's relationship with man, and also prophesying about Jesus who's about to come. Now we have the New Testament, 27 books. They start off with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These books are talking about Jesus now coming and his life on the earth, Jesus. Mainly the end of his life. His name was Emmanuel, which means God with us. So now instead of a tabernacle where God dwells, he dwells in a person, Jesus. And this person is God. This is what he was telling his disciples. His disciples then, now he gets crucified and resurrects. They start to spread that story and that message and that new revelation. The disciples were Jewish people, and now they're trying to tell other Jewish people, hey, look, this Old Testament was the shadow. We now have the person. When you have a person, you have a shadow. That was the Old Testament. Now you have the real person and they're trying to tell people. A lot of the Jews didn't like it, so that's what Acts is. It's a history of how they went out and tried to spread this message. It also talks about Paul. His name was Saul. He became Paul. He was a top Jew. He was zealous for the Old Testament way, but he met Jesus on the road. Actually, it was as a spirit. He met Jesus, and he told Paul, when you hurt Christians, you hurt me. So we find out that the whole purpose of the Old Testament, New Testament, is for God and man to have a relationship, for us to be brought into to becoming the church, a spiritual house for God to dwell in. So not just Jesus, he's the cornerstone. The whole building now is the church, and he dwells in the church today. So if you want to find God, he is in the church today, which are the people, those who follow Jesus, calling his name. So that's what Acts is about, the spreading that message. Paul gets converted, and he starts to go tell non-Jews. And so that's what the big chunk in the middle of the Bible, of the New Testament, is. A lot of those books are letters that Paul wrote to different congregations, teaching them, helping them understand this new revelation, encouraging them. So these are letters from Paul. Then we have some other letters from some of the disciples who actually were with Jesus when he was on earth. They wrote some letters out to different churches, and like Peter, he also went to Gentiles, which were people who were non-Jewish people. So he went out, and this message began to spread all over the whole earth. And then we end with Revelation. Revelation is the final book of what God's doing from Genesis all the way till the end of time. When he returns the second time, the Bible says he's going to come back, and he's going to come back for his bride, his built-up church. The church eventually we see as a bride. So that's it. It's so cool. In Revelation, there's all these crazy things happening, supernatural calamities, Antichrist. We all know about that. But there's also a couple at the very end, Christ and the church, the Spirit and the bride. In the Genesis, we start off with Adam and Eve, and in Revelation, we have Christ and the church. In Genesis, we have a river of water of life and a tree of life. In the New Testament, we also have a river of water of life and a tree of life. In the Old Testament, we have a paradise. In the New Testament, we have an eternal paradise with God, and where God and man dwell together, and they're representing God on the earth. So God has a universal couple. That's what the whole Bible, it's a divine romance. Starts off with the Genesis with a couple, ends off in Revelation with a couple. So this is a beautiful book. It's wonderful. It's amazing. This is just a recap. I hope you can get into it and really enjoy and dive into it and find out the purpose of why you're on earth, what God has for man, and where man is for God. Thank you.